Okay, so welcome to the after-dinner session. There is a handout for anyone who didn't get one going around. Yeah, you might want to raise your hands. I was told they're outside on a table. Maybe somebody could bring them in and pass them around. I am also instructed to tell you that there will be a reception after this, outside in the hallway, and that tomorrow we will be starting at 9:30, not at 9 a.m., so you can sleep in a little longer than you did today. My name is Andrew Shignell. I was one of Robert Adams's students, and so it's an honor for me to introduce him. There's a big sense in which Bob needs no introduction at an event like this, honoring Leibniz among Leibniz scholars, philosophers of religion, and so forth. But Sam instructed me to say something a little bit more than affiliation and talk title, and so I'll try to say a little something. Bob, though, said keep it short, so I'll also try to do that. One of the things you might do in a context like this, by way of introduction, is tell a story about the person you're introducing. And having studied with Bob and known him for a long time now, there are a number of different stories that one could tell. One of my favorites is the one that goes something like this, when some of us, and I suspect that this has happened to many of his students, asked him early on in our graduate career. There was a whole generation of us sitting together and asked him once whether he found one metaphysical system more plausible than some other metaphysical system. And he said that for a long time it had been kind of a toss-up between the two most plausible systems, that of Berkeley and that of Leibniz. Right? And I don't think he's ever come clean about which he has decided is most plausible. So you sort of have to do a little bit of detective work, and in preparing for this introduction, I tried to do some of that by thinking about Bob's life and looking at his CV. I mean, imitation is in some sense the best form of flattery, or at least sign of allegiance, and so I think I came up with some results. I mean, there's an early part of Bob's career in life where it looks like it's heading in the Berkeley direction. He gets ordained, as many of you will know. He studied at Oxford, and Berkeley is buried there. It's like sort of a way of imitating. Right? He's working on idealism, but then there are much more recently, and actually for the bulk of his career, I think evidence is that push in the Leibnizian direction. So, for instance, he's much more interested in metaphysics than in epistemology, and tends not to work too much on epistemology. He does ethics in a very Platonistic vein. He's got incredibly wide-ranging interests, maybe not as eclectic as Leibniz, but impressive range on issues in philosophy of religion, modality, the nature of love. He's written on Buber and Schleiermacher and Kant and various other historical figures. He's written a lot, of course, on Leibnizian themes in the context of working on Leibniz himself. As you know, Leibniz had political interests and worked politically as a diplomat for part of his career. Bob has most recently written a long 80-page introduction to the senior thesis of John Rawls, which was discovered in the Princeton Library and published along with an essay that he wrote in his 70s under the title, A Brief Inquiry into the Meaning of Sin and Faith with On My Religion. And Bob's title of the introduction, this long introduction, is The Theological Ethics of the Young Rawls and Its Background. So all of these things suggest, I think, that Leibniz, at least, is winning out. But the last consideration that I thought might be conclusive, the other thing is that he hasn't, in his later career, gone into kind of pseudo-scientific speculations about cure-alls and various other panaceas. Though you also haven't written a history of a famous house. So,
no, and I haven't written a book on geology either.
No, not on geology either. But this pattern, I thought, was conclusive evidence. So as you know, Leibniz wrote towards the end of his career this book that we're talking about during this conference, the Theodicy, on issues in the problem of evil and justifying God's ways to humanity in the face of evil. Well, it turns out that one of Leibniz's first philosophical works was also about this issue, the Confessio. He wrote that towards the middle of his 20s, or was working on these issues, and seems only towards the end of his career to return to it, though it's interspersed throughout his career as well. So if you look at Bob's current work, he's writing, as many of you will also know, a book on sexuality and sexual ethics. So here we are towards the end of his career, and he's working on sexuality. And so in order to pick up the Leibnizian pattern, I went to the CV and looked for the very first piece that Bob had ever written, and noticed that it was called Anticipation and Consummation. I think is conclusive evidence that we have another Leibnizian pattern here in Bob's career. But he tells me it actually was about eschatology. All right, without further silliness, Robert Mary Hugh Adams of the University of North Carolina on justice, happiness, and perfection in Leibniz's City of God.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be introduced by you, and I'm, as others are, very grateful to Mike and Sam and the Templeton Foundation for setting up this terrific conference and opportunity for lots of us who are very interested in Leibniz to get together and share work and thoughts. Great occasion. There is a handout. Has it been passed around? It's really just a bunch of quotations from Leibniz with some indication of where they fall in the 5 parts of the talk. I should say that it will be hard to follow this talk from the printed text because the printed text was considerably too long to be delivered orally in a reasonable time. So I've shortened it considerably, but not just by chopping out an easily identifiable chunk. Shortened it in various places, rearranged some pieces, and even added a few bits here and there. So here we go. Justice, happiness, and perfection in Leibniz's City of God. The word theodicy, Theodicy or Theodikeia, appears to have been coined by Leibniz. Its Greek etymology suggests the meaning theodike, God's justice. God's justice is the title topic of Leibniz's book. The vindication of God's justice is certainly one of the central aims of the book. Nothing, I believe, more clearly marks Leibniz, for all his personal and institutional conservatism, as an archetypal theologian of the Enlightenment in Protestant Germany, than his emphasis on justice as an attribute of God and the way in which he conceives of it. The first section of my lecture is devoted to elucidation of Leibniz's conception of divine justice. In the second section, I will argue that his vindication of God's justice, so conceived, depends not just on the perfection of the actual world, but also, or even primarily, on the happiness and virtue of the city of God, which Leibniz conceives as composed of all and only intelligent substances, with God as its ruler. This discussion will be continued in sections 3 and 4, with attention to Leibniz's claims about the happiness of those who love God and the punishment of others in the city of God, and will conclude in the 5th and final section of the lecture with exploration of the epistemological modality of some of these claims. Section 1, justice. Leibniz declares, quote, 1, that God's goodness and his justice, as well as his wisdom, do not differ from ours, except that they are infinitely more perfect. The univocal attribution of moral properties to God and to human beings is an Enlightenment theme that still resonates in John Rawls's insistence in on my religion, that the basic judgments of reasonableness must be the same, whether made by God's reason or ours.